Welcome. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also, comment which video you found the scariest. Now lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. The descent began with a familiar, damp chill. The rope, slick and cold, bit into my gloved hands. The cave mouth, a mere slit in the cliff face, receded into blackness above. We, the seasoned few, navigated the familiar initial passages with practiced ease. The rock, rough and damp, offered a reliable grip. The faint luminescence of our headlamps cut through the absolute darkness, revealing the intricate, ancient architecture of the earth. The rain, a distant drumbeat outside, grew in intensity. Water, initially a trickle, began to seep into the cave, transforming pathways into miniature streams. We pushed onward, the promise of virgin passages driving us deeper. The air, already stale, became increasingly saturated. The sound of dripping water, a constant companion, morphed into a rushing torrent. A tremor, a deep, resonant shudder ran through the rock beneath our feet. The water, no longer a trickle, surged, a dark, churning force. We scrambled, our boots slipping on the slick, submerged rock. The passageway, once a navigable route, transformed into a raging river. The roar of the water, a deafening cacophony, drowned out all other sounds. Panic, a cold, constricting fear, gripped my chest. The cave, our sanctuary, had become our tomb. The rising water, a relentless adversary, pursued us deeper. We retreated, our movements hampered by the surging current. The passages, once familiar, became a disorienting labyrinth. The beam of my headlamp, reflecting off the water, created distorted, dancing shapes on the cave walls. The water level rose rapidly, filling crevices and submerging ledges. We climbed, clinging to the rough rock, our fingers raw and bleeding. The air, thin and stale, burned our lungs. The darkness, absolute and impenetrable, pressed in on us, a suffocating blanket. The sound of the rushing water, a constant deafening roar, filled every crevice of the cave. We found a higher chamber, a temporary refuge. The water, surging below, continued to rise. The air, stale and thin, grew increasingly difficult to breathe. The cold, relentless and penetrating, seeped into our bones. The rock, damp and slick, offered little comfort. The light from our headlamps, dimming with each passing minute, flickered and danced on the damp walls. The water, now only a few feet below, continued its relentless ascent. The silence, broken only by the rushing water, was more terrifying than any scream. The darkness, absolute and consuming, pressed in on us, a constant, suffocating presence. The water, cold and dark, crept closer, inch by inch. The air, thin and stale, grew increasingly difficult to draw into my lungs. The darkness, a tangible entity, pressed in, a suffocating embrace. The sound of the rushing water, a constant, deafening roar, filled every corner of the chamber. The water, now lapping at the edges of our refuge, continued its relentless climb. The air, thin and stale, offered little sustenance. The darkness, absolute and consuming, pressed in, a suffocating shroud. The sound of the rushing water, a constant deafening roar, echoed through the cavern. The water, cold and dark, reached my feet. The air, thin and stale, burned my lungs. The darkness, absolute and consuming, pressed in, a suffocating tomb. The sound of the rushing water, a constant deafening roar, filled every crevice of the cave. The water, now waist-deep, continued its relentless ascent. The air, thin and stale, offered little relief. The darkness, absolute and consuming, pressed in, a suffocating grave. The sound of the rushing water, a constant deafening roar, filled every corner of the cavern. The water, cold and dark, reached my chest. The air, thin and stale, offered no respite. The darkness, absolute and consuming, pressed in, a suffocating void. The sound of the rushing water, a constant deafening roar, echoed through the cave. The water, cold and dark, reached my neck. The air, thin and stale, offered no escape. The darkness, absolute and consuming, pressed in, a suffocating oblivion. The sound of the rushing water, a constant deafening roar, filled the cave. The entrance to the cave was barely visible, concealed by dense foliage at the base of a remote hillside. We, a small team of experienced spelunkers, had been anticipating this exploration for weeks, ever since the initial discovery of the cavern system. Excitement pulsed through us as we squeezed through the narrow opening, our headlamps cutting through the absolute darkness. The initial passage opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling lost in the blackness above the reach of our lights. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and minerals. Water trickled down the walls, and the silence was profound, broken only by the sound of our boots crunching on the uneven floor. We moved cautiously, our beams sweeping across intricate formations of stalactites and stalagmites, evidence of the slow work of time and water. The cave system was a complex network of winding tunnels and interconnected chambers, each turn revealing new and fascinating geological features. We documented our findings meticulously, taking photographs and making notes. After several hours of exploration, we reached a section where the passage narrowed significantly. We proceeded single file, our bodies brushing against the cold, damp rock walls. The floor here was uneven, covered in loose stones and patches of slick mud. Then a sudden cry echoed from ahead. It was Mark. His light, which had been leading the way, abruptly disappeared. A moment of stunned silence was followed by the sickening thud of a falling body. "Mark!" I yelled, my voice echoing in the confined space. We rushed forward, our headlamps converging on the spot where Mark had been. The passage floor ended abruptly in a gaping hole, an unseen pit that plunged into darkness. We shone our lights down into the abyss, but the beam disappeared into the blackness without revealing the bottom. "Mark, can you hear us?" another team member called out. A faint groan drifted up from the darkness, confirming our worst fears. Mark was down there, injured. We immediately began to assess the situation. The walls of the pit were steep and smooth, offering no handholds or footholds. We had ropes and harnesses, but not nearly enough to reach the bottom, which seemed impossibly deep. Panic began to set in. We were in an unmapped section of a newly discovered cave. No one knew our precise location above ground. Our communication devices were useless this far beneath the surface. We tried to rig a rope, using the longest one we had, but it fell far short of the bottom. We could hear Mark's weak calls for help, but we couldn't reach him. The realization of our helplessness was crushing. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity as we struggled to find a solution. We tried widening the passage to see if there was another way down, but the rock was solid and unforgiving. Our tools were inadequate for such a task. Our initial excitement had morphed into a gnawing dread. The silence of the cave, once peaceful, now felt menacing, amplifying our desperation. The air grew colder, and a damp chill seeped into our bones. We rationed our remaining food and water, knowing that our ordeal could last for a long time. The faint sounds of Mark's suffering from below were a constant reminder of our failure. One of our team members, Sarah, began to sob quietly. The hopelessness of our situation was overwhelming. We were trapped, with a critically injured friend, at the bottom of an unreachable pit. As the hours passed, Mark's calls for help grew weaker and less frequent. The silence from the pit became more prolonged, punctuated only by occasional moans. We continued our futile attempts to find a way down, our energy and hope slowly draining away. The darkness seemed to press in on us, a tangible manifestation of our despair. One of us noticed a narrow fissure in the wall of the passage, near the edge of the pit. It was barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it seemed to lead downwards at a gradual angle. It was a long shot, but it was the only option we had left. We decided to try it one at a time, inching our way through the tight space. The passage was claustrophobic, the rock walls pressing in on all sides. The air was stale and close. After what seemed like an endless crawl, the fissure opened into a small circular chamber. We shone our lights around, but there was no sign of Mark and no other exits. The chamber was a dead end. Defeated, we crawled back through the fissure to the main passage. The silence from the pit was now absolute. Mark was no longer calling out. A profound sense of despair settled over us. We had failed. We were lost, trapped, and our friend was likely gone. As we sat there, huddled together in the darkness, a faint sound drifted from the depths of the pit. It was a soft, scratching sound, like something dragging itself across the stone. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was definitely there. It grew slightly louder and then stopped. A moment of silence followed. Then the scratching sound returned, this time accompanied by a low, wet gurgle. It was a disturbing sound, one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The sounds continued, the scratching and gurgling echoing up from the black abyss. They seemed to be getting closer to the edge of the pit. We shone our lights down into the darkness, our beams trembling. We couldn't see anything, but the sounds were unmistakable. Something was moving down there. And then a new sound joined the others, a soft rhythmic clicking like small bones being knocked together. It was a chilling sound, one that resonated deep within our chest. The clicking grew louder, and then a faint, high-pitched whine drifted up from the pit. It was a sound unlike anything we had ever before encountered. The scratching, gurgling, clicking and whining sounds continued, a cacophony of disturbing noises emanating from the darkness below. They were definitely getting closer. We huddled back from the edge of the pit, our hearts pounding in our chests. The beams of our headlamps danced nervously across the walls of the passage, and then, from the darkness, a pair of luminous dots appeared, small, glowing points of light that seemed to pierce the blackness. They were moving slowly, deliberately, upwards. The sounds from the pit intensified as the glowing dots rose higher. We could now make out a vague shape below them, something pale and elongated, moving with an unsettling fluidity. The luminous dots continued to ascend, and the shape below them became clearer. It was long and thin, with multiple appendages that moved with a jerky, insect-like motion. The clicking sound seemed to be coming from its mouth area. The glowing dots reached the edge of the pit and emerged into the passage. They were eyes. Small, black, and intensely bright, and they were attached to a creature unlike anything we had ever imagined. It pulled itself out of the pit, its pale, elongated body glistening in the beam of our headlamps. Its multiple appendages scrabbled against the rock floor, making the scratching sound we had before. The clicking sound emanated from its elongated snout, which opened and closed in a silent, horrifying display, its black, luminous eyes fixed on us. And then, from its throat, came the high-pitched whine we had before, now much louder, closer. It was a sound that promised unimaginable pain, and then, from the darkness of the pit behind it, another pair of luminous dots appeared, and another. We stood frozen, our lights fixed on the creature before us as more of them began to emerge from the darkness below. The whining, clicking and scratching sounds filled the passage. They were all coming for us. The entrance to the mammoth crystal caverns was impressive, a vast opening in the hillside that promised wonders within. Our group of tourists, a mix of ages and nationalities, gathered excitedly around the guide, a young man with a bright smile and an air of confidence. The initial part of the tour was as expected, a well-lit path leading through enormous chambers filled with breathtaking crystal formations. The guide pointed out various features, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. We marveled at the beauty, taking photographs and enjoying the spectacle. After a while, the paved path ended, and the guide led us down a narrower passage, explaining that we were now entering a less-traveled section of the cave. The lighting became less intense, relying more on strategically placed spotlights to illuminate the formations. The air grew cooler and damper. At one point, while navigating a particularly tight bend, the guide stumbled. There was a sharp cry of pain, and he collapsed to the ground, clutching his ankle. It was immediately apparent that the injury was serious. He couldn't put any pressure on his leg. Panic rippled through our group. The guide, our only point of contact with the outside world and our only source of knowledge about the cave system, was incapacitated. We were alone, deep underground. We tried to help him, but moving him was difficult and caused him considerable pain. Eventually, we managed to prop him up against a rock wall. He apologized profusely, explaining that he had taken a wrong turn somewhere back in the unlit section. We were no longer on the marked trail. The realization sank in slowly, chilling us despite the damp air. We were lost in an unmapped part of the mammoth crystal caverns, a labyrinth of twisting tunnels and dead ends. Our guide, injured and unable to lead, could only offer vague directions based on his fading memory of the correct path. We decided to try and backtrack, retracing our steps as best we could. But the unlit sections of the cave looked eerily similar, a confusing maze of rock formations and winding passages. Without the guide's knowledge, we quickly became disoriented. Days began to bleed into one another. We had a limited supply of food and water, which we tried to ration carefully. But the portions were small, and hunger became a constant gnawing sensation in our stomachs. Our thirst was never fully quenched. The light from our flashlights seemed inadequate against the vast darkness of the cave. Shadows danced on the walls, playing tricks on our eyes. Every rustle of loose rock, every drip of water sounded amplified in the silence, making us jumpy and anxious. Sleep became a fitful, uneasy affair, punctuated by the cold, the discomfort, and the growing fear. We huddled together for warmth, but the chill of the cave seemed to seep into our bones. As our food supplies dwindled, so did our hope. The endless tunnels looked the same, offering no landmarks, no indication that we were any closer to an exit. Despair began to set in, a heavy feeling that made each step more difficult. One of the tourists, an elderly woman, became ill. Whether it was from the cold, the lack of food, or the stress of our situation, we didn't know. But she grew weaker each day, barely able to move. The silence of the cave, once a novelty, now felt menacing, broken only by our own ragged breathing and the occasional cough. The darkness pressed in, a tangible entity that seemed to suffocate us. We tried calling out for help, but our voices echoed into the void, swallowed by the vastness of the cave. There was no response, no sign that anyone knew we were lost. One evening, as our flashlights cast long, distorted shapes on the cave walls, we stumbled upon a narrow passage we hadn't noticed before. It was barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it seemed to lead downwards. Desperate, we decided to take it. The passage descended steeply, the air growing colder and damper. The only way to proceed was to slide down on our backs, pushing ourselves forward with our hands and feet. The darkness here felt more profound, almost absolute. After what seemed like an eternity, the passage opened into a small circular chamber. The beams of our flashlights danced across the walls, revealing nothing but smooth black rock. There were no other exits. In the center of the chamber there was a small pool of water. It was still and dark, reflecting the beams of our lights like black glass. As we approached the edge of the pool, we noticed something floating on the surface. It was a small white bone, then another and another. Soon we realized the pool was filled with dozens of small bones scattered across the dark surface. They looked like finger bones. A chilling draft emanated from the pool, carrying a faint metallic scent. The silence in this chamber felt different, heavier, somehow expectant. One of the tourists gasped, pointing to the wall behind the pool. Carved into the smooth black rock were symbols, not random scratches, but deliberate markings arranged in patterns. They looked ancient, alien. As we stared at the symbols, trying to decipher their meaning, a faint sound echoed from somewhere deeper within the chamber. A soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the stone floor. The sound grew slightly louder, coming from behind the pool. From a section of the chamber we couldn't see clearly, the scraping continued, a slow, deliberate sound that sent shivers down our spines. We shone our flashlights towards the source of the sound, but the darkness beyond the pool was impenetrable. The scraping grew closer, and then a faint clicking sound joined it, like small stones being knocked together. The clicking became more insistent, the scraping continuing in a steady rhythm, and then, from the darkness beyond the pool, a pair of luminous dots appeared. Small, glowing points of light that seemed to pierce the darkness. They were too regular, too focused to be reflections. The glowing dots moved slowly, deliberately, towards the edge of the pool. The scraping and clicking sounds grew louder. We stood frozen, our flashlights fixed on the 2 points of light as they emerged from the darkness. They were eyes, small, black, and intensely bright, and they were attached to something that was now emerging from the shadows behind the pool. Something long and pale, moving with a slow, sinuous motion. The scraping sound came from the end of its body, dragging across the rock. The clicking sound came from its mouth, opening and closing silently in the darkness. The eyes fixed on us, and the scraping and clicking sounds grew louder, filling the small chamber. The long, pale form continued to emerge from the shadows, its luminous eyes never leaving ours. It was still coming. The jungle canopy gave way to a gaping hole in the earth, the entrance to a cave system far larger than any we had previously encountered in this region. Excitement rippled through our small research team as we prepared to descend into the darkness. This discovery promised to yield significant geological and biological findings. The initial descent was straightforward, leading us into a vast network of tunnels and chambers. The air inside was humid and still, carrying a damp, earthy smell. Our headlamps illuminated walls covered in intricate formations, evidence of millennia of water erosion. The silence was broken only by the sound of our boots on the cave floor and the occasional drip of water. We ventured deeper, mapping the passages and collecting samples. The cave system was a labyrinth, branching off into numerous smaller tunnels, each holding its own unique geological features. Days turned into nights as we explored, our initial enthusiasm gradually giving way to a sense of awe at the sheer scale of this subterranean world. Then, one of our team members, Ben, began to complain of an itching sensation on his arm. We examined it under the bright beams of our headlamps and found a small patch of discolored skin, slightly raised and with a strange, almost velvety texture. We initially dismissed it as a minor skin irritation, perhaps from contact with some unknown plant or insect. However, over the next few days, the patch on Ben's arm grew larger and more pronounced. The discoloration deepened, taking on a disturbing greenish hue. The velvety texture became more pronounced, almost like a layer of fine moss. Ben complained of increasing discomfort, a burning sensation that kept him awake at night. We had a basic medical kit, but nothing that seemed appropriate for this type of affliction. We tried antiseptic cream, but it had no effect. The infection, whatever it was, seemed to be spreading rapidly in the warm, damp environment of the cave. The changes in Ben became more alarming. The fungal growth now covered a significant portion of his arm, and smaller patches began to appear on his neck and face. The texture was no longer velvety, but had become almost furry, with tiny, hair-like filaments. He became increasingly agitated, scratching at the infected areas until they bled. His condition deteriorated rapidly. The fungal growth continued to spread, covering more and more of his body. His breathing became labored, and a strange, musty odor emanated from him. He was clearly in immense discomfort, though he could no longer articulate his pain. We knew we had to get him out, but the cave system was vast and complex. Our supplies were dwindling, and our own morale was beginning to fray under the strain of Ben's suffering and the oppressive atmosphere of the cave. Navigating the tunnels became increasingly difficult. Ben could barely walk, and we had to take turns supporting him. The fungal growth had begun to affect his mobility, stiffening his joints and making his movements jerky and unnatural. The infection continued its horrifying progression. The fungal filaments grew longer and denser, resembling a grotesque living moss that covered his entire body. His features became distorted, almost unrecognizable beneath the fungal mass. The musty odor intensified, becoming cloying and sickening. We pressed on, driven by a desperate hope of finding an exit. The cave seemed endless, a maze of dark passages that twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the earth. The only light came from our headlamps, their beams cutting through the gloom, revealing the endless rock and the horrifying spectacle of Ben's transformation. One day, as we were navigating a particularly narrow passage, we noticed a faint glow emanating from ahead. Hope surged through us. Could it be sunlight? An exit? As we rounded a bend, the glow intensified, revealing a large chamber. But it wasn't sunlight. The light came from the walls themselves. The rock was covered in a bioluminescent fungus, emitting an eerie, greenish light that illuminated the chamber in a spectral glow. In the center of the chamber, we found a vast pool of water. The water was still and dark, reflecting the strange light from the walls, and around the edges of the pool we saw them. Others, figures lying motionless on the damp rock, their bodies completely covered in the same grotesque fungal growth that had consumed Ben. But these were not our colleagues, these were different. Their forms were wrong, elongated limbs, distended torsos, features barely discernible beneath the thick layer of fungus. And then, one of them stirred. Slowly, jerkily, it rose to its feet. Its body was completely encased in the fungal growth, only two glowing eyes visible in the dim light. It turned its head towards us, and from its fungal-covered throat came a soft, rustling sound, a sound like the wind blowing through dry leaves, a sound that was somehow welcoming. Then another figure rose, and another. Soon the chamber was filled with these fungal-covered beings, their glowing eyes fixed on us. The rustling sound intensified, a chorus of dry whispers filling the cavern. Ben, who had been lying still for hours, suddenly twitched. The fungal growth on his body seemed to pulse, the filaments writhing slightly. He let out a soft rustling sigh, the same sound as the others. He stood up, his body now completely covered in the living fungus. His eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the others. He turned to us, and from his fungal-encased mouth came the same dry, rustling sound. He reached out a fungal-covered hand towards me. The rustling sound grew louder all around us. The other figures began to move, their fungal bodies swaying gently in the strange green light. I looked down at my own arm, a small patch of discoloured skin slightly raised, with a strange, almost velvety texture. The entrance to the cavern was unassuming, a dark gash in the hillside almost hidden by overgrown ferns. An unfamiliar location marked only by a faint notation on an old map I'd acquired. Excitement, a familiar companion on these solo explorations, bubbled within me as I squeezed through the narrow opening. The passage opened into a large chamber, the ceiling lost in the darkness above the beam of my headlamp. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and minerals. Water trickled down the walls, and the silence was profound, broken only by the occasional drip echoing through the vast space. I moved cautiously, my boots crunching on loose rocks and gravel. The cavern was a labyrinth of winding passages and smaller chambers, each turn revealing new formations of stalactites and stalagmites sculpted by time and water. The thrill of discovery propelled me deeper into the earth's embrace. One passage narrowed considerably, requiring me to turn sideways and inch my way through. The rock walls pressed in close and cold. It was a tight squeeze, but I had navigated many such constrictions before. This one, however, felt different. The rock smoother, almost polished in places. Then it happened. My foot slipped on the slick surface. There was a moment of weightlessness, a sickening lurch, and then a sharp, excruciating pain shot through my leg as I landed awkwardly in a sudden drop. Darkness enveloped me as my headlamp tumbled away, its beam bouncing erratically before settling on a distant wall. I gasped, the pain radiating up my leg, making me nauseous. I tried to move, but a searing agony stopped me. My leg was broken. I knew it instantly. Panic began to set in. I was wedged in a narrow crevice, deeper than I realized. The fall must have been into a hidden fissure, concealed by the tight passage. I reached for my headlamp, my fingers fumbling in the darkness until I found it. The beam illuminated my surroundings, a cramped space, barely wide enough to turn around in, with rough, unforgiving rock walls. I tried to shift my position, but the pain was unbearable. I was trapped, my leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The realization of my predicament hit me with the force of a physical blow. Alone, deep underground. No one knew where I was. My cell phone was useless, as expected in such a remote location and deep within the earth. My only source of light was my headlamp, its battery life finite. I had some water and a few energy bars in my pack, but they wouldn't last forever. Days blurred into a nightmarish sequence of pain, thirst, and gnawing fear. The beam of my headlamp grew weaker, its glow a dim circle in the oppressive darkness. I tried to ration its use, turning it on only when absolutely necessary, the stretches of absolute blackness amplifying my isolation. The silence was broken by the constant drip of water, each drop echoing in the confined space, a morbid metronome counting down the time. Sometimes I imagined other sounds, rustlings, scrapes, whispers carried on the still air, but I dismissed them as tricks of my mind, the product of pain and sensory deprivation. My thirst became a constant torment, my lips cracked and dry. The few sips of water I allowed myself offered only temporary relief. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but the pain in my leg made it difficult to even reach for the energy bars in my pack. The darkness played tricks on my eyes, even when the headlamp was on. Grotesque shapes seemed to form in the shadows, the rough rock walls morphing into monstrous faces. My mind, starved of stimulation, began to conjure phantoms in the blackness. One time, as the light flickered weakly, I thought I perceived a pair of eyes reflecting the beam. Large, luminous eyes, watching me from the deeper darkness of the crevice. I blinked, and they were gone. A hallucination, I told myself, a product of my desperate situation. The air grew stale, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A musky, animalistic scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The beam of my headlamp grew fainter, casting long, distorted shapes on the walls. The batteries were almost dead. Soon I would be plunged into absolute darkness, with only the drip, drip, drip of water for company. Just as the last vestiges of light flickered and died, plunging me into an inky blackness so profound it felt like a physical pressure, I heard it again. The scratching. Faint at first, but growing steadily louder. A dry, scraping sound coming from somewhere above me in the narrow passage where I had slipped. The scratching intensified, becoming frantic, insistent. It sounded like claws on rock, tearing at the surface. The sound echoed in the confined space, amplifying the terror that gripped me. Then a new sound joined the scratching, a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated through the rock and into my very bones. It was a sound of pure, animalistic hunger, and it was getting closer. The scratching stopped directly above me. The growling intensified, just beyond the thin layer of rock separating me from whatever was up there. I lay in the darkness, my broken leg throbbing, listening to the sounds of something immense and hungry moving just out of sight. The plunge into the Stygian depths felt like entering another world. The water was surprisingly clear, illuminated by the powerful beams of our underwater lights, revealing a breathtaking landscape of submerged rock formations. My dive partner Ben signaled his okay, and we continued our exploration of the underground river. The current was gentle, carrying us deeper into the cavern system. Schools of blind cavefish darted past, their pale bodies ghostly in the artificial light. The silence, broken only by the sound of our own breathing apparatus, was profound, lending an almost otherworldly quality to the experience. We navigated through narrow underwater passages, the walls adorned with calcite deposits that glittered like diamonds. The pressure increased subtly as we descended further, a constant reminder of the immense volume of water above us. Everything felt serene, a peaceful exploration of a hidden realm. Then a sudden change. A hissing sound erupted from behind me. I turned to see Ben frantically pointing at his oxygen tank. A stream of bubbles escaped rapidly, indicating a catastrophic malfunction. His eyes, wide with alarm, met mine. Our pre-dive checks flashed through my mind. A faulty valve? A cracked cylinder? Whatever it was, his air supply was rapidly depleting. We were deep within the cave system, far from the surface, with a compromised oxygen tank. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I fought it down. We had trained for emergencies like this. The priority was to ascend and fast. I signaled to Ben that we needed to go up, pointing towards the direction of the surface. He nodded, his movements already showing signs of exertion. The effort of swimming against the subtle current, combined with the stress of the malfunctioning tank, was clearly taking its toll. We began our ascent, kicking powerfully against the water. The underwater cave system was disorienting. Without sunlight or clear visual cues, it was easy to lose direction. We relied on our compasses and the faint memory of our route down, but the urgency of the situation made it difficult to think clearly. Ben's breathing became more erratic, the sound of his regulator strained. I kept a close eye on him, my own anxiety mounting with every passing moment. The distance to the surface felt impossibly vast. The water grew colder as we ascended, a chilling reminder of the depths we had reached. My own air supply felt finite, the regulator hissing with each breath. The thought of running out of air before reaching the surface sent a fresh wave of panic through me. We passed through familiar formations, but they seemed different in our panicked state. The angles distorted, the distances stretched. The feeling of being trapped, surrounded by tons of rock and water, became almost unbearable. Ben suddenly stopped, clutching his chest. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated. He pointed frantically at his pressure gauge, which was rapidly approaching zero. He was running out of air. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him upwards. He kicked weakly, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. The surface seemed miles away, a distant hope in the murky water. My own air supply was dwindling rapidly. The regulator began to feel tight, each breath requiring more effort. The edges of my vision started to darken. We continued to ascend, my arm locked around Ben's, pulling him with what little strength I had left. The disorienting twists and turns of the underwater passages seemed endless. Then a change in the water. It felt slightly warmer, and a faint, diffused light began to penetrate from above. The surface, we were close. Hope surged through me, a powerful antidote to the encroaching panic. I kicked harder, pulling Ben with me. The light grew stronger, illuminating the final stretch of our ascent. We broke the surface with a gasp, sucking in huge gulps of air. The relief was immense, a physical sensation that washed over me. We had made it. But as I looked around, my relief turned to confusion. Then, a chilling realization. We were not where we had entered. The opening above us was different, smaller, and the surrounding rock formations were unfamiliar. We had surfaced in a different part of the cave system, a section we had never explored. The heavy rain that had been falling outside had apparently flooded this upper chamber, creating a temporary pool that allowed us to surface. The chamber was small and enclosed, the air stale and damp. There was no obvious exit, no way back to the main cave entrance. We were alive, but still trapped. now in an air-filled chamber with no clear way out. Ben, still weak and disoriented, coughed and sputtered, trying to regain his breath. I scanned the walls of the chamber with my light. They were smooth and sheer, rising to a low ceiling that offered no handholds. A narrow passage, barely wide enough to squeeze through, led off from one side of the chamber, disappearing into darkness. It was our only option. We exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of our continued predicament. Exhausted and disoriented, we began to crawl into the narrow passage, the darkness swallowing us whole. The air grew colder and carried a faint, earthy odour. The passage twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the unknown. Then a sound from behind us, from the flooded chamber. A soft splashing, as if something had entered the water. We turned our lights back, but the surface of the water was still and dark. Then another splash, closer this time, and then a series of soft clicks, echoing from the darkness of the chamber we had just left. The descent into the Devil's Throat sinkhole was treacherous, but filled with anticipation. Our team of archaeologists and explorers had followed ancient maps to this remote location, hoping to find evidence of a long-lost cave dwelling. The air grew cooler as we rappelled down the sheer rock face, the beam of my headlamp cutting through the gloom. The sinkhole was vast, a natural amphitheatre plunging deep into the earth. The walls were scarred with geological history, layers of rock telling tales of millennia. Finally, we reached the bottom, a relatively flat area littered with loose stones and debris. The remnants of what could indeed be ancient structures were visible, partially buried under centuries of accumulated sediment. We spent hours carefully excavating, uncovering pottery shards and worked stone, each find fueling our excitement. The possibility of a major discovery spurred us on, the arduous descent already feeling worthwhile. Then the sound, a deep rumbling vibration that shook the ground beneath our feet. We looked up just in time to see a cascade of rocks break loose from the upper reaches of the sinkhole. The roar was deafening as tons of stone plummeted downwards. We scrambled for cover, but it was too late. The main section of our climbing rope, still anchored above, was directly in the path of the rockfall. The sickening snap echoed around the sinkhole as the rope parted, severed by the impact. Silence descended once more, heavy and absolute. We looked at each other, the horror of our situation dawning on our faces. Our only way out, our lifeline to the world above, was gone. We were trapped at the bottom of a deep sinkhole, with sheer, unclimbable walls rising hundreds of feet above us. Panic threatened to engulf us, but we fought it back, focusing on assessing our resources. Our food and water supplies were limited, intended for a day's exploration, not an indefinite entrapment. Our communication devices, useless in this subterranean bowl, offered no hope of signaling for help. We tried to find another way out, searching the perimeter of the sinkhole for any natural passages or ledges that might offer a route upwards, but the walls were relentlessly vertical, smooth and unforgiving. Our headlamp beams revealed no cracks or crevices that could provide a foothold. Days began to blur into a monotonous cycle of rationing supplies and futile attempts to find an escape. The darkness, when we turned off our lights to conserve battery power, was absolute, broken only by the drip of water echoing from the unseen heights above. The temperature dropped significantly at night, the cold seeping into our bones despite our layers of clothing. Sleep offered little respite, filled with anxious dreams of rescue that never came. Our hunger became a constant gnawing sensation, our thirst an unquenched torment. The small portions of food and water we allowed ourselves provided only temporary relief. The weight of our predicament grew heavier with each passing hour. One of our team members tried shouting for help, his voice echoing upwards, swallowed by the vastness of the sinkhole. There was no response, only the mocking silence of the stone walls. Despair began to set in, a creeping hopelessness that made each task feel monumental. The once exciting exploration had become a terrifying fight for survival. The ancient dwelling we sought now felt like a cruel lure that had led us to this subterranean prison. As our light sources began to dim, the darkness became more oppressive. The beams of our headlamps flickered intermittently, casting distorted shapes on the rock walls, playing tricks on our eyes. Every rustle of loose rock, every imagined sound sent jolts of fear through us. One evening, as we huddled together for warmth, we noticed a faint luminescence emanating from a fissure in the rock wall near the base of the sinkhole. It was a soft, ethereal glow pulsing gently. Curiosity overcoming our fear, we approached the fissure. The glow intensified as we drew nearer, revealing a narrow opening that seemed to lead into a smaller cavern. Hesitantly, we squeezed through the opening, our headlamps illuminating a small chamber. The source of the luminescence was a cluster of strange glowing fungi growing on the damp rock walls. The light they emitted was faint, but provided a welcome respite from the oppressive darkness of the sinkhole. As we explored the small chamber, we noticed a narrow passage leading further into the rock. It was a tight squeeze, but the possibility of finding another exit, a way back to the surface, spurred us on. We crawled through the passage, the air growing colder and carrying a faint, earthy odor. The passage twisted and turned, descending gradually into deeper darkness. After what seemed like an eternity, the passage opened into a larger cavern. The beams of our headlamps revealed a vast, subterranean space, the ceiling lost in the blackness above. The air here was still and heavy, and the silence was profound. In the center of the cavern, we saw something that made our blood run cold. A massive pile of bones scattered across the cave floor. They were not animal bones. They were human. As we cautiously approached the pile, we noticed something else. Carved into the far wall of the cavern were symbols. Not the random markings of nature, but deliberate, intricate glyphs that seemed to writhe and twist before our eyes. As we stared at the symbols, a faint sound echoed through the cavern, a soft scratching, like nails on stone. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper within the cave system, beyond the reach of our lights. The scratching grew slightly louder, and then a series of soft clicks joined it, like small stones being knocked together. The sounds were coming closer. We extinguished our headlamps, plunging ourselves into absolute darkness. The only light, the faint glow from the fungi back in the small chamber. The scratching and clicking sounds continued to approach, drawing nearer and nearer. And then a soft sigh, right beside me. A breath of air in the darkness. The maw of the earth yawned before us, an invitation to the darkness within. Our team of spelunkers, driven by a thirst for exploration, descended into the Grimfang cave, a network rumored to extend for miles beneath the rugged terrain. We noted the loose scree near the entrance, the occasional cracking sound from the rock above, but our eagerness overshadowed any apprehension. We ventured deeper, our headlamps illuminating a world of intricate formations and winding passages. The air grew cooler and damper, carrying the scent of wet stone and minerals. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the cave floor and our own breathing. We pushed onward, eager to map new sections of the cavern. As we navigated a particularly narrow passage, a low rumble vibrated through the rock. It grew rapidly, escalating into a violent shaking that threw us off balance. Rocks rained down from the ceiling, and the walls groaned under immense pressure. An earthquake deep underground. The shaking subsided as quickly as it began, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Dust filled the air, obscuring our vision. We coughed, our lungs burning. When the dust settled somewhat, we turned back towards the entrance, our initial bravado replaced by a primal urge to escape. But the passage behind us was gone. A massive rockfall had sealed it completely, tons of debris blocking the way we had come. The earthquake had not only trapped us, but had also shifted the very structure of the cave. Panic flickered in the beams of our headlamps as we surveyed our surroundings. The familiar landmarks were gone. Passages that had been open before were now blocked by fallen rock, while new openings had appeared where solid walls once stood. The cave was no longer the maze we had been exploring. It was a completely unfamiliar labyrinth. We tried to orient ourselves, consulting our maps, but they were now useless, depicting a cave that no longer existed. We were lost in a transformed world of rock and darkness, with no clear way back to the surface. Our supplies, intended for a day trip, suddenly felt woefully inadequate. Food and water were limited, and the batteries in our headlamps would eventually die, plunging us into absolute blackness. We chose a passage that seemed to lead upwards, hoping to find another exit, but the tunnels twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the earth. The disorientation intensified, the endless succession of similar-looking rock formations blurring together. Exhaustion began to set in, our bodies aching from the constant climbing and crawling. The air grew stale, and a sense of claustrophobia began to creep in, the feeling of being trapped in an endless maze of stone. The silence of the cave, once a source of wonder, now felt menacing, amplifying our isolation. Every rustle of loose rock, every distant echo sent shivers of apprehension down our spines. The darkness seemed to press in, a tangible entity that threatened to suffocate us. One of our team members stumbled and fell, his headlamp clattering to the ground and extinguishing. He cried out in pain, his voice swallowed by the darkness. We helped him up, but his ankle was clearly injured, making our progress even slower. As our light sources began to fail, the darkness became more profound, more terrifying. The beams of our remaining headlamps cast long, distorted shapes on the cave walls, playing tricks on our eyes. We found a small chamber and decided to rest, conserving our energy and light. The silence here was broken only by our ragged breathing and the occasional drip of water. A sense of profound hopelessness settled over us. Then a sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible, a scratching coming from somewhere beyond the chamber. It was a dry, scraping sound like claws on rock. We froze, our headlamps fixed on the darkness beyond the chamber entrance. The scratching continued, becoming slightly louder, more insistent. It seemed to be getting closer. Then another sound joined the scratching, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the rock beneath us. It wasn't the rumble of another earthquake, but something deeper, more organic. The thrumming intensified, and the scratching grew more frantic. A faint, high-pitched whine drifted from the darkness, a sound unlike anything we had ever encountered. The sounds were definitely approaching, drawing nearer and nearer to our small chamber. We huddled together, our fear growing with each passing moment. The darkness outside seemed to pulse, and the air grew colder. Then, at the entrance to the chamber, a pair of luminous dots appeared in the darkness, small, black, and intensely bright. They seemed to pierce the gloom, fixed on us with an unnerving intensity. The thrumming, scratching, and whining sounds intensified as the luminous dots moved closer, resolving into eyes. And behind them, a shape began to emerge from the darkness of the passage, something long and pale, moving with an unsettling fluidity. More luminous dots appeared behind it, countless eyes reflecting the faint light from our dwindling headlamps. They were all coming for us, from the depths of a cave that was no longer familiar, in a darkness that held unimaginable terrors. The entrance to the glacial ice cave shimmered, a turquoise archway, into a world of frozen wonder. I adjusted my headlamp, the beam illuminating walls of crystalline ice sculpted into breathtaking formations by meltwater and time. The air inside was frigid, carrying a faint, crisp scent. I ventured deeper, the crunch of my boots on the icy floor the only sound in the otherwise silent expanse. The cave system was intricate, a network of tunnels and chambers carved through the heart of the glacier. Light filtered through the ice in places, creating an ethereal glow. I documented the unique formations, marveling at the ephemeral beauty of this frozen landscape. The stability of these structures was always a concern, but today the ice felt solid, unyielding. Then a sound, a deep groan like the mountain itself was sighing. It echoed through the ice cave, a chilling resonance that vibrated through my boots. Before I could react, the ice around me began to shift. Cracks spider-webbed across the walls, and the ceiling above began to sag. The collapse was sudden and violent. Tons of ice crashed down, the sound deafening. I threw myself to the ground, shielding my head with my arms as the world around me fractured and fell. The light from my headlamp was extinguished as I was buried under a crushing mass of frozen debris. Darkness descended, absolute and suffocating. The pressure was immense, the icy fragments pressing in on all sides. I struggled to move, but I was completely trapped, pinned beneath the frozen avalanche. Panic clawed at my throat, but I fought it down, focusing on the immediate need for air. I tried to expand my chest, but the ice around me was unyielding. There had to be an air pocket, a small space amidst the debris where I could breathe. With agonizing effort, I shifted a small piece of ice near my face, creating a tiny gap. A rush of frigid air filled my lungs, a temporary reprieve from the suffocating darkness. But the air was thin, and the space was small, barely enough to take shallow breaths. The cold began to seep in, a biting chill that penetrated my layers of thermal clothing. The temperature inside the ice cave was already below freezing, and trapped beneath tons of ice it was dropping rapidly. My fingers and toes began to numb. I tried to move again, desperately attempting to free myself from the icy prison, but the ice was packed tightly around me, an unyielding tomb. The pain from the crushing pressure was a constant throb. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. I focused on conserving my air, taking shallow breaths, trying to ignore the growing desperation. The cold intensified, my body shaking uncontrollably. My headlamp was somewhere nearby, buried under the ice. If only I could reach it, a small beam of light would offer a sliver of hope in this frozen abyss. But my arms were pinned, my reach limited. The air in my small pocket grew stale, the faint crisp scent replaced by the smell of my own breath. The cold became unbearable, my muscles stiffening, my thoughts becoming sluggish. I began to lose sensation in my extremities. The biting chill had progressed to a deep, bone-numbing cold that threatened to extinguish the last vestiges of warmth in my body. Then a sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible, a scraping coming from somewhere above me, through the solid ice. It was a dry, grating sound, like something dragging itself across the frozen surface. I strained my ears, listening intently. The scraping continued, becoming slightly louder, more insistent. It seemed to be moving, traversing the icy barrier above me. Then the scraping stopped. A moment of silence followed, broken only by my own shallow breathing and the faint creaking of the ice around me. And then a new sound. A low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the ice. It wasn't the sound of shifting ice, but something deeper, more organic. It resonated in my chest. A deep, persistent vibration that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the glacier. The thrumming intensified, and the ice around me began to vibrate slightly. The scraping sound returned, this time accompanied by a soft clicking, like small stones being knocked together. The sounds were definitely approaching, drawing nearer and nearer to my frozen tomb. I strained my eyes in the absolute darkness, trying to see something, anything through the solid ice above. Then a faint luminescence appeared directly above me, not the diffused light from the surface, but a focused internal glow emanating from within the ice itself. It pulsed gently, casting an eerie light on the frozen debris around me. As the luminescence intensified, I could make out a shape within the ice above, something long and pale, moving with an unsettling fluidity. The scraping and clicking sounds grew louder, and the thrumming vibrated through my very bones. The shape above me shifted, and a pair of luminous dots appeared within the ice. Small, black, and intensely bright, they seemed to pierce the frozen barrier, fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. The thrumming reached a crescendo, and the scraping and clicking sounds were directly above me. The luminous dots moved closer, resolving into eyes, and then the ice above me began to crack. Not the sharp fracture of a collapse, but a slow, deliberate parting, as if something was forcing its way through. A sliver of darkness appeared, widening slowly, and from within that darkness, a cold breath touched my face. The rusted gate groaned as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent woods. A gaping maw in the hillside marked the entrance to the abandoned Black Creek mine, a place whispered about in hushed tones by the locals. We, a group bound by youthful recklessness and a thirst for the unknown, were undeterred by the tales of unstable tunnels and forgotten dangers. The air grew cooler as we stepped inside, the sunlight fading behind us, replaced by a damp, earthy smell. Our headlamps cut cones of light through the absolute darkness, illuminating the rough-hewn walls of the passage. Water trickled down the rock face, and loose stones crunched under our boots. The silence inside was profound, broken only by our own breathing and the occasional drip. We ventured deeper, the tunnel winding and descending into the earth. The rock around us seemed to press in, the weight of the mountain above a constant unseen presence. The beams of our lights danced across the uneven surfaces, revealing veins of quartz that glittered faintly. The further we went, the more the temperature dropped, a clammy chill that seeped into our bones. The passage narrowed, forcing us to walk single file. The air became noticeably stagnant, lacking the freshness of the outside world. A sense of confinement began to creep in, a primal discomfort with being so far beneath the surface. Still we pressed on, drawn by the allure of the unknown depths. Then a sound. Deep within the earth, a low rumble resonated through the rock. It wasn't sharp or sudden, but a drawn-out groan, like the mountain itself was shifting in its sleep. The sound vibrated through the ground beneath our feet, a tangible tremor that sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine. The groaning intensified, becoming a chorus of creaks and pops. Small pebbles began to fall from the ceiling, scattering around us like tiny warnings. Panic flickered in the beams of our headlamps as we exchanged frantic glances. The unstable nature of the mine, once a thrilling prospect, now felt like a suffocating threat. A primal urge to flee took hold. We turned back, our earlier bravado replaced by a desperate need to escape the suffocating darkness. We scrambled over loose rocks and through narrow passages, our movements clumsy with fear. The groaning of the earth seemed to follow us, growing louder, more insistent. We reached a wider section of the tunnel, the one that led back towards the entrance. But as we rounded a bend, our headlamp beams illuminated a horrifying sight. A massive pile of rock and debris blocked the passage, completely sealing off the way we had come. The collapse must have happened just moments before. The sound we had been hearing, the death throes of the tunnel. The darkness became absolute, the dust from the collapse obscuring our headlamp beams. We coughed, the air suddenly thick with particles. A wave of despair washed over me as the reality of our situation sank in. Trapped, deep underground. We tried to clear the blockage, our hands scrabbling at the enormous rocks, but it was futile. The collapse was too massive, the weight of the earth too great. The groaning had stopped, replaced by a profound, terrifying silence. The air grew stale, the dust settling to create a thin film over everything. Our breathing became ragged, each inhale feeling less satisfying than the last. The darkness pressed in, a tangible entity that seemed to suffocate us. Time lost all meaning in the black void. We huddled together, our only comfort the faint warmth of each other's bodies. The silence was broken only by our shallow breaths and the occasional cough. The feeling of confinement intensified, a crushing sensation that made it hard to draw a full breath. The beams of our headlamps grew dimmer, the batteries slowly draining in the oppressive darkness. The air became thinner, each breath a struggle. A dull ache began to throb in my head, a sign of the dwindling oxygen. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. The darkness was complete, absolute, a void that swallowed all light and sound. I stared into the blackness, my eyes wide, straining to see something, anything. Then a different sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible. A scratching, high-pitched and insistent, coming from somewhere beyond the collapsed section. It was a dry, scraping sound, like claws on rock. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It seemed to be coming closer, the sound echoing in the confined space. My breath hitched in my throat. The others shifted nervously beside me. The scratching stopped abruptly. Silence descended once more, heavier and more menacing than before. Then a soft thud, just once, as if something had fallen. From the darkness beyond the collapse, a faint, rhythmic tapping began. Slow, measured tap, tap, tap. The tapping continued, a steady, unnerving beat in the absolute darkness. It echoed through the tunnel, each tap resonating deep within my chest. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping grew slightly louder, the rhythm unchanging. It was a persistent, unsettling sound, a counterpoint to the silence. Tap, tap, tap. The air grew colder, a sudden drop in temperature that sent goosebumps across my skin. The tapping continued, its steady beat filling the void. Tap, tap, tap. A faint whisper of air brushed against my cheek as if something was very close. The tapping continued, unwavering. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping stopped. The silence returned, but it felt different now, charged with an unseen presence. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. Then a soft sigh, just a breath of air, but close, very close. The darkness remained absolute. The silence stretched on, unbroken, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that we were no longer alone. The entrance to the abyss cave was a narrow fissure in the mountainside, a dark moor promising depths unexplored. Our team of geologists and speleologists, equipped with advanced monitoring gear, prepared for a descent into the unknown. The initial readings had indicated unusual atmospheric compositions deep within, a phenomenon we were eager to document. The descent was arduous, involving ropes and harnesses to navigate sheer drops and narrow passages. The air grew cooler and damper as we went deeper, the sunlight fading completely behind us. Our headlamps illuminated the rough rock walls, revealing intricate formations sculpted by millennia of geological processes. Several hours into our exploration, our atmospheric sensors began to register elevated levels of carbon dioxide. The readings were still within acceptable safety margins, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere was perceptible. A faint, almost metallic scent permeated the air. As we continued our descent, the carbon dioxide levels climbed steadily. A slight lightheadedness began to affect me, a subtle feeling of disorientation. I noticed my breathing becoming a little more rapid, a subconscious effort to draw in more air. The other members of the team also began to exhibit similar symptoms. A colleague stumbled slightly, catching himself on the cave wall. Another paused, rubbing his temples as if fighting off a headache. Communication became less precise, our instructions occasionally muddled. We decided to halt our descent and reassess the situation. The elevated carbon dioxide was clearly impacting our cognitive functions. Continuing deeper would be reckless. The priority now was to ascend back to the surface. The ascent proved to be far more challenging than the descent. The dizziness intensified, making it difficult to maintain balance on the narrow ledges. Our coordination was impaired, our movements becoming clumsy and uncertain. Simple tasks like securing ropes or clipping harnesses required a concerted effort. Confusion began to cloud my thoughts. Familiar passages seemed different, the way back no longer clear. I had to concentrate intensely to remember the sequence of climbs and traverses we had made on our way down. The other team members were also struggling. One kept repeating the same question, his face etched with bewilderment. Another moved with a vacant stare, seemingly unaware of his surroundings. The cave system, which had earlier felt like an exciting frontier, now seemed like a treacherous maze. The twisting passages and identical rock formations blurred together, making navigation increasingly difficult. Our headlamp beams danced erratically as we stumbled through the darkness. My breathing became more labored, my chest feeling tight. The metallic scent in the air seemed stronger, almost acrid. The lightheadedness intensified, morphing into a persistent dizziness that made the world spin. I lost track of time. The ascent felt endless, a disorienting climb through a world of shadows and distorted perceptions. My thoughts became fragmented, my memory unreliable. I would start to climb only to forget where I was going or what I was doing. The last clear memory I have is of clinging to a rope, my hands slipping, the rough rock scraping against my skin. The world swam in my vision, the beam of my headlamp a blurry circle in the darkness. A profound weariness washed over me, an overwhelming urge to simply let go, then a sensation of floating, a detachment from my body. The sounds of the cave faded, replaced by a muffled ringing in my ears. The blurry circle of light dissolved into an all-encompassing darkness. A strange awareness remained, a sense of presence without physical sensation. I could perceive the cold, damp air against my skin, though I could no longer feel it. The metallic scent was still there, sharp and pungent. A faint sound began to penetrate the ringing in my ears, a low, resonant thrumming like a distant engine. It vibrated through the rock, a deep, persistent hum that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. The thrumming intensified, becoming almost painful. It resonated within my skull, a deep, vibrating drone that filled the void. The metallic scent seemed to grow stronger, accompanied by a new odor, something sweet and cloying like decaying flowers. Then a flicker of something in the darkness, not light, but a subtle shift in the absence of light, a momentary distortion in the blackness. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it left a lingering impression of something vast and shapeless moving in the periphery of my awareness. The thrumming continued, its deep resonance vibrating through the darkness. The sweet cloying odor intensified, becoming almost suffocating. And then another flicker in the darkness, this one lasting a fraction longer, a glimpse of something immense and indistinct, a dark mass shifting in the void. The thrumming reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that filled the nothingness. The sweet odor became overpowering, nauseating. And then a final flicker in the darkness, clearer this time. A brief, fleeting image of something vast and ancient, something with countless eyes opening. The entrance to the Colossus cave system was immense, a gaping maw in the earth that swallowed the already dim morning light. Our group of adventure tourists, eager for an adrenaline rush, gathered around our guide, a young man named Ben who exuded a nervous enthusiasm. He assured us it would be an unforgettable experience. The initial descent was straightforward, following well-worn paths into the cavern's belly. The scale of the place was breathtaking. Vast chambers, stretching beyond the reach of our headlamps, adorned with colossal formations of rock that seemed to defy gravity. The silence was profound, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional drip of water echoing through the immense space. After several hours, we reached a lower section of the cave, the air growing noticeably damper. Ben pointed out a network of tunnels that branched off, explaining that these were accessible only during dry periods. As if on cue, a distant rumble reached us, growing steadily louder. Ben's face paled, rain, and by the sound of it, a significant downpour. Within minutes, the sound of rushing water became unmistakable. Ben, his earlier confidence completely gone, urged us to retreat to higher ground. The lower tunnels were flooding rapidly, cutting off our return route. We began to climb, following Ben into a series of narrow, winding passages that led upwards into uncharted territory. The rock here was rough and uneven, offering precarious handholds and footholds. Exhaustion began to set in quickly, the constant upward climb taking its toll. The higher we climbed, the more disoriented we became. The passages twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the labyrinthine cave system. The familiar landmarks of the lower levels were long gone, replaced by an endless succession of similar-looking rock formations. Hours passed. Our water supplies dwindled, and hunger gnawed at our stomachs. The beams of our headlamps grew weaker, casting dim circles in the oppressive darkness. The initial thrill of adventure had long since been replaced by a growing sense of dread. Ben, clearly out of his depth, consulted his rudimentary map, but it offered no information about this part of the cave. We were hopelessly lost. The realization hung in the air, a suffocating blanket of despair. We tried to find a spot with cell service, holding our phones aloft in the darkness, but the thick layers of rock above offered no connection to the outside world. We were completely cut off, with no way to signal for help. The silence of the cave, once awe-inspiring, now felt menacing, amplifying our isolation. Every rustle of loose rock, every distant echo sent shivers of apprehension down our spines. The darkness seemed to press in, a tangible entity that threatened to consume us. One of the tourists, a middle-aged woman, stumbled and fell, scraping her knee badly. Her cries of pain echoed through the tunnels, a stark reminder of our vulnerability. Our already low morale sank further. As exhaustion reached its peak, our movements became sluggish and uncoordinated. We huddled together for warmth, the damp chill of the cave seeping into our bones. Sleep offered no respite, only fitful moments of unease punctuated by the cold and the gnawing hunger. Days blurred into a nightmarish cycle of climbing, stumbling and resting in the darkness. The endless passages offered no sign of an exit, no indication that we were any closer to rescue. Hope, once a flickering flame, began to dwindle to a mere ember. One evening, as we rested in a small alcove, the beam of my headlamp caught something on the wall. It was a series of markings etched into the rock, not the random scratches of geological processes, but deliberate symbols arranged in a pattern. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, angular and alien. As I examined them closer, a prickling sensation ran down my spine. There was something unsettling about their precise, almost geometric form. I pointed them out to the others. Ben, despite his inexperience, seemed particularly disturbed by the markings. He shook his head, muttering something about old legends and forgotten things that dwelled in the deep places of the earth. As we continued to explore, we found more of these symbols, appearing with increasing frequency. They seemed to guide us deeper into the cave system, leading us down passages we might otherwise have avoided. The air began to change. It became heavier, almost viscous, carrying a faint, sweet odor that was strangely cloying. The silence of the cave seemed to deepen, taking on a quality of anticipation. One night, as we navigated a particularly narrow tunnel, the beam of my headlamp illuminated something ahead. It was a section of the passage wall that seemed different. The rock here was smoother, almost polished, and it had a faint internal luminescence. As we approached, the luminescence intensified, revealing intricate patterns within the rock itself. They pulsed with a soft internal light, creating an eerie, hypnotic effect. We stood there mesmerized by the glowing patterns when a low, resonant thrumming began to vibrate through the rock beneath our feet. It was a deep, persistent sound that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the cave. The thrumming grew stronger, and the glowing patterns on the wall pulsed more rapidly. The sweet odor in the air intensified, becoming almost overpowering. A feeling of dizziness washed over me, and the world around me seemed to waver. Then, from the darkness ahead, a sound. Not a natural sound of the cave, but something else. A soft, shuffling sound, like something dragging itself across the stone floor. It was faint, but in the profound silence of the cave it was unmistakable. The shuffling sound grew slightly louder, and then a series of soft clicks joined it, like small stones being knocked together. The sounds were coming closer. We extinguished our headlamps, plunging ourselves into absolute darkness. The only light, the faint pulsing glow from the patterns on the wall. The shuffling and clicking sounds continued to approach, drawing nearer and nearer. And then a soft sigh right beside me, a breath of air in the darkness. The beam of my headlamp danced across the crystalline walls of the newly discovered cavern. I was alone, meticulously charting the contours of this subterranean world, a task that always filled me with a sense of profound satisfaction. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water and the scratch of my pen against the waterproof paper. The passage ahead narrowed abruptly, leading to what appeared to be a small ledge overlooking a deeper section of the cavern. I tested the ground with my boot, but the edge crumbled unexpectedly. There was a sickening lurch, a moment of weightlessness, and then I was falling, the beam of my headlamp spinning wildly. The climbing rope, secured above, snapped with a sharp crack. The impact jarred my entire body, and a searing pain shot through my left arm. Darkness enveloped me as my headlamp bounced away, its beam settling on the sheer rock wall opposite where I had landed. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to assess the damage. My arm throbbed relentlessly. It was broken, I was certain. I tried to move, but the pain was excruciating. I was stranded at the bottom of a deep pit. The beam of my headlamp revealed the extent of my predicament. The walls of the pit were vertical, smooth rock, offering no handholds or footholds. The snapped end of my rope dangled uselessly from above, far out of reach. Escape seemed impossible. Panic began to bubble up, a cold knot of fear in my stomach. I was alone, deep underground, with a broken arm and no way to climb out. No one knew exactly where I was in this unmapped section of the cavern. I tried to signal, shouting upwards, but my voice echoed into the void, swallowed by the vastness of the cave. There was no response, only the oppressive silence. Hours crawled by. The beam of my headlamp grew dimmer, a constant reminder of my dwindling resources. I tried to make myself as comfortable as possible on the uneven floor of the pit, but the pain in my arm was relentless. Thirst began to set in, my mouth feeling dry and parched. I had a small water bottle in my pack, but I knew I had to ration it carefully. Time stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The darkness, when I turned off my headlamp to conserve the battery, was absolute, a suffocating void that pressed in on all sides. Strange sounds seemed to emanate from the blackness, faint rustlings, distant drips, whispers carried on the still air. My mind, deprived of sensory input, began to play tricks on me. One time, as I lay there in the darkness, I thought I perceived a faint glow emanating from somewhere below me, a soft, ethereal luminescence that seemed to pulse gently. I dismissed it as a hallucination, a product of my isolation and pain. As the days passed, my hope began to dwindle. The pain in my arm was constant, and my thirst became a gnawing torment. The darkness, even with the headlamp on, seemed to grow heavier, more menacing. The silence was broken by a new sound, a faint scratching high above, near the top of the pit. It was a dry, scraping sound, like claws on rock. I strained my ears, listening intently. The scratching continued, becoming slightly louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the very edge of the pit, just beyond my line of sight. Then the scratching stopped abruptly. A moment of silence followed, more profound than before, and then a soft thud, as if something had fallen onto the ledge above. A new sound drifted down into the pit, a soft, wet sniffing followed by a low growl. It was a sound unlike any animal I knew, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the air. The growling intensified, becoming more insistent, more menacing. It seemed to be circling the edge of the pit above me, its unseen presence filling the confined space with a palpable sense of dread. I shone my headlamp upwards, the beam cutting through the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making those sounds. But the ledge above remained shrouded in shadow. The growling stopped, replaced by a new sound, a soft rhythmic clicking like small bones being knocked together. It was a chilling sound, one that resonated deep within my chest. The clicking grew louder, and then a faint, high-pitched whine drifted down into the pit. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever encountered, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and unseen horrors. The clicking and whining sounds continued, echoing in the darkness above me. They seemed to be getting closer to the edge of the pit, as if whatever was up there was preparing to descend. Then from the darkness at the very top of the pit, a pair of luminous dots appeared, small, black, and intensely bright. They seemed to pierce the darkness, fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. The clicking and whining sounds intensified as the luminous dots began to descend, slowly, deliberately into the pit. I could now make out a vague shape below them, something pale and elongated, moving with an unsettling fluidity. The luminous dots continued their descent, and the shape below them became clearer. It was long and thin, with multiple appendages that moved with a jerky, insect-like motion. The clicking sound seemed to be coming from its mouth area. The luminous dots reached my level, and I could see them clearly now. They were eyes, small, black, and filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. And they were attached to a creature unlike anything I had ever imagined. It hung there in the darkness, its pale, elongated body suspended above me, its black eyes fixed on mine. The clicking sound emanated from its snout, which opened and closed silently, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. The high-pitched whine filled the confined space, a sound that promised unimaginable pain. And then from the darkness above, another pair of luminous dots appeared, and another. The entrance to the Blackmoor cave was deceptively small, a dark slit in the hillside that belied the vast network of tunnels within. Our team of experienced cavers, eager to explore its uncharted depths, squeezed through the opening, our headlamps illuminating the cool, damp rock. We navigated winding passages, marveling at the intricate formations sculpted by millennia of water erosion. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the cave floor and the occasional drip of water echoing through the darkness. We ventured deeper, our excitement growing with each new discovery. Then we entered a large chamber, the ceiling lost in the blackness above. The air here was different, carrying a musky scent. As our headlamp beams swept across the space, we realized the source of the odor. The chamber was filled with bats, thousands upon thousands of them clinging to the walls and ceiling, their leathery wings folded around their tiny bodies. Our presence startled them. A wave of fluttering erupted as the bats took flight, filling the chamber with a cacophony of high-pitched squeaks and the rustling of wings. We instinctively ducked, trying to shield our faces from the sudden flurry of creatures. In the chaos, I felt a sharp sting on my hand. Looking down, I saw a small bat clinging to my glove, its tiny teeth embedded in the leather. I shook it off quickly, a surge of adrenaline mixed with a prickle of alarm. We retreated from the chamber as quickly as possible, the swarm of bats following us for a short distance before dispersing back into the darkness. We examined my hand. There was a small puncture wound, bleeding slightly. We cleaned it with antiseptic wipes from our first aid kit, trying to dismiss the incident as a minor mishap. However, as we continued our exploration, a sense of unease settled over us. The image of the bat, its sharp teeth, kept replaying in my mind. A few hours later, I began to feel unwell. A creeping warmth spread through my body, accompanied by a dull ache in my head. The feeling intensified rapidly. A fever gripped me, my skin flushed and hot. I felt dizzy and disoriented, the familiar passages of the cave seeming alien and confusing. My vision blurred and phantom images flickered at the edges of my sight. The others in the group noticed my deteriorating condition. Concern etched their faces as they helped me find a place to rest. But there was little they could do. We were deep underground with no way to contact the outside world. My fever climbed higher, and the hallucinations became more vivid. The cave walls seemed to writhe and twist, the rock formations morphing into grotesque faces. I saw creatures scuttling in the periphery of my vision, their forms shifting and indistinct. Paranoia began to take hold. I became suspicious of my companions, their concerned expressions seeming to hide something sinister. I felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling that they were somehow involved in what was happening to me. My thoughts raced, disjointed and irrational. I imagined whispers in the darkness, unseen entities lurking just beyond the reach of our headlamps. The silence of the cave, once comforting, now felt menacing, filled with unseen presences. My physical condition worsened, my body ached all over and my limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. The dizziness intensified, making it difficult to stand. I felt nauseous and a persistent cough racked my body. The hallucinations became more intense, more terrifying. The darkness around us seemed to coalesce into monstrous shapes, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. I cried out, my voice hoarse and weak, but my companion's reassurances did little to calm my rising panic. Time lost all meaning. The fever raged and my consciousness flickered in and out. I experienced vivid, nightmarish visions, indistinguishable from reality. I felt trapped in a waking nightmare with no escape. The cave itself seemed to become a living entity, its passages twisting and turning, leading us deeper into its dark embrace. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The musky odor of the bats seemed to permeate everything, clinging to my skin, filling my nostrils. In my fevered delirium, I imagined the bats were still with us, their silent forms flitting just beyond the reach of our lights, their glowing eyes watching us from the darkness. I could almost feel the brush of their wings against my skin. My paranoia reached a fever pitch. I accused my companions of plotting against me, their attempts to help me seeming like part of some elaborate deception. I lashed out at them, my words slurred and incoherent. As my condition worsened, a strange transformation began to occur. My skin felt tight and itchy, and a prickly sensation spread across my body. I scratched at my arms and legs, but the itching only intensified. Looking down at my hands, I noticed something disturbing. My skin seemed to be changing, becoming paler, almost translucent, and beneath the surface I could see faint blue lines spreading like a network of veins. The lines pulsed faintly, and a cold sensation spread through my limbs. My vision grew increasingly blurred, and the hallucinations intensified, taking on a more grotesque and disturbing quality. I felt a strange compulsion to seek out the darkness, to crawl into the deepest recesses of the cave. The light from our headlamps became unbearable, cyan and painful to my eyes. My companions tried to restrain me, their faces etched with fear and concern, but I fought them with a strength I didn't know I possessed, driven by an instinct I couldn't understand. I managed to break free, stumbling into a narrow passage that led downwards into deeper darkness. The cold, damp air felt strangely comforting against my burning skin. I crawled through the passage, drawn by an unseen force. The faint blue lines on my skin pulsed with an eerie light, illuminating the way ahead. The itching intensified, and I felt a strange, irresistible urge to scratch, to tear at my flesh. The passage opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling lost in the darkness above. The air here was intensely cold, and the sweet, cloying odor was overpowering. In the center of the chamber, I could make out a faint, swirling vortex of darkness. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, drawing me towards it with an irresistible pull. As I stumbled towards the vortex, I noticed other figures in the chamber, barely visible in the dim light. They were huddled together, their bodies contorted in strange and unnatural positions. Their skin was pale and translucent, crisscrossed with the same faint blue lines I saw on my own hands. They turned their heads towards me as I approached, their eyes glowing with a faint, eerie luminescence. And from their throats came a soft rustling sound, like the fluttering of countless wings. The vortex of darkness pulsed, and a pair of luminous eyes opened within its depths, staring directly at me. They were vast and ancient, filled with an infinite, unknowable hunger. The rustling sound intensified all around me, and then I felt a sharp sting on my neck. The entrance to the Blackwood Caverns was familiar, a place my son Leo and I had explored many times before. Its well-maintained paths and impressive formations always held a sense of wonder for us both. Today we decided to venture a little beyond the usual tourist route into a section known as the Crystal Labyrinth. The passage narrowed as we went deeper, the walls sparkling with calcite crystals that reflected the beams of our headlamps. Leo, always eager, was a few steps ahead of me, his light dancing excitedly over the formations. The air was cool and still, the silence profound. Then the tremor. It wasn't violent, just a sudden, deep rumble that vibrated through the rock beneath our feet. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and for a moment everything seemed to sway. Before I could react, a deafening crash echoed through the tunnel. Tons of rock and debris cascaded down, filling the passage ahead. The light from Leo's headlamp vanished abruptly. A wall of stone separated us, solid and impenetrable. "Leo!" I yelled, my voice swallowed by the sudden silence. No response, just the settling of dust and the drip of water. Panic seized me. He had been just ahead, right where the collapse occurred. I scrambled toward the pile of rock, my hands scrabbling at the loose stones, trying to find a way through. The rocks were jagged and unstable, shifting under my touch. "Leo!" I called again, my voice hoarse. Still nothing. I shone my headlamp on the blockage. It was massive, a seemingly insurmountable wall of rock that stretched from floor to ceiling. The passage beyond was completely sealed off. Desperation fueled my efforts. I began to pull away the smaller rocks, tossing them behind me. My hands were soon raw and bleeding, but I didn't stop. I had to reach him. The air in the tunnel became thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. I coughed, my lungs burning. The beam of my headlamp danced erratically as my hands worked frantically. Hours must have passed. The beam of my headlamp began to dim, a stark reminder of the limited time I had. I had to work faster. The silence, broken only by the sound of my own efforts and ragged breathing, was deafening. Each moment that passed without a response from Leo filled me with growing dread. I managed to clear a small section of the blockage, creating a narrow gap. I squeezed through, hoping to find a way around the main collapse. The passage beyond was choked with smaller debris, but I could see a sliver of light further ahead. I crawled through the tight space, pushing aside loose rocks, my body aching with exhaustion. Finally, I reached the other side of the main collapse. The passage here was partially blocked, but I could see the beam of Leo's headlamp lying on the ground a short distance away. It was still on, illuminating a small pocket of space. "Leo!" I shouted, my voice cracking with emotion. Silence. I scrambled towards the light, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the small space, illuminated by his headlamp. It was a small alcove, shielded from the main force of the collapse. Leo wasn't there. His headlamp lay on the ground, its beam pointing towards a narrow opening in the rock wall at the back of the alcove. It was a tight squeeze, barely wide enough for a child to pass through. "Leo!" I called again, my voice barely a whisper. I squeezed through the opening, scraping my arms and legs against the rough rock. The passage beyond was narrow and winding, descending steeply into the darkness. The beam of my own headlamp was now very weak, casting only a dim circle of light. The air here felt different, colder, with a faint, earthy odor. I followed the narrow passage downwards, my hope dwindling with each step. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. The passage opened into a small chamber. The beam of my failing headlamp barely illuminated the space. The walls were damp and slick, and the air was heavy with the same earthy smell. Leo wasn't here either. But on the ground near the center of the chamber I found something, a small muddy handprint. It looked like his, and next to it another, and another, leading towards a narrow fissure in the far wall, a crack in the rock that seemed to disappear into absolute darkness. I called his name again, my voice filled with a desperate plea. Only silence answered. The beam of my headlamp flickered, then died, plunging me into complete darkness. The silence was broken only by the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. I reached out, my hands finding the cold, damp rock of the chamber wall. I could feel the narrow fissure ahead, a sliver of darkness within the greater darkness. I took a step towards it, my hand outstretched. The earthy odor seemed stronger here. Then, from the darkness beyond the fissure, I heard a sound, a soft scraping sound, like nails on stone. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The scraping sound grew slightly louder, and then a soft sigh, a breath of air, carried on the still cold air of the chamber, and then a small wet cough. It sounded very close. "Leo?" I whispered into the darkness, my voice trembling. No response, only the drip of water and the faint scraping sound from beyond the fissure. I reached the fissure and peered into the blackness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a faint draft of cold air coming from within. And then I noticed something on the ground near the fissure, something small and pale. I reached down and picked it up. It was one of Leo's small plastic dinosaurs, a Tyrannosaurus Rex he always carried in his pocket. I held it tightly in my hand, the silence of the chamber pressing in on me. The scraping sound from beyond the fissure continued, a faint, persistent noise in the darkness. And then, from the darkness, another sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping. Distant but distinct, it sounded like a heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. The thumping grew slightly louder, the rhythm steady and unwavering. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the fissure, from somewhere beyond my sight. The scraping sound continued, a counterpoint to the steady thumping. I stood there in the absolute darkness, the small plastic dinosaur clutched in my hand, listening to the faint scraping and the steady thumping that seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth. The cold air from the fissure brushed against my face, and then the thumping changed. It became faster, more frantic. Tap, 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 tap. And then it stopped, abruptly, leaving only the drip of water and the faint, persistent scraping sound coming from the darkness beyond the fissure.